Hello everyone, it's Mike here today to talk about another book, and this one is a historical fiction spy novel, although more falling into that historical fiction category than the traditional spy novel archetype. The book is The Alice Network by Kate Quinn, a book published originally in 2017 about women working underground in France during World War I to collect intelligence on the advancing German troops. I heard about it much closer to that time, actually. I saw a positive review of it on NPR's website, and then I later saw that it made NPR's 2017 Best Books of the Year list, and that list usually contains at least some books that I find worthwhile. I'm going to keep this review totally spoiler-free, since in this case I don't really think it's necessary to get into spoilers to talk about the gist of what this book is about. The book is based on a real-life group of women spies called the Alice Network. It follows two parallel narratives with two parallel characters. One of them, called Evelyn or Eve Gardner, is a young French woman who joins the aforementioned Alice Network in the late 1910s in the midst of World War I and goes undercover working at a cafe to eavesdrop on the German soldiers who frequent the establishment. The other, Charlotte or Charlie St. Clair, is a college-aged American woman in a timeline right after World War II has ended, and she's searching for her cousin Rose, who went missing somewhere in France during the war. Charlie's search begins with a rendezvous with none other than Eve Gardner herself, now in her mid-50s, who she has learned might be able to help her track down her beloved cousin. For the rest of the book, we follow the two of them as they travel through France on the trail of Charlie's cousin, and Eve reminisces about her World War I experience with the Alice Network in a way that for me really worked quite well in parallel despite my initial skepticism about this. So as readers, we learn Eve's story at the same time as Charlie is learning her story. The downside, though, was that one of the characters is far more interesting than the other, both as a character and as an overall storyline. Eve's narrative was definitely the one carrying the story, as she's both a stronger character and has a more interesting set of life circumstances. For one thing, Eve has more potential interest right from the start because we see her in both timelines, one when she was young and then over 30 years later when she seems to have gone a bit crazy, so we know that something must have happened to her and that we're going to learn about it as the story progresses. But the story is properly really about her, because it was she and not Charlie who was a member of the original Alice Network. I'm not alone in this sentiment either, as I saw it echoed all over the place in the reviews I read on Goodreads and watched on YouTube. That said, even Eve's character didn't always add up completely for me. She's described as a strong-willed character who's willing to do pretty much anything to pay any price to serve her country in the war, and yet her character in the earlier timeline, even if not totally helpless, doesn't quite ring true to this description. It's not like she's egregiously off the mark or anything, but maybe it's just that she exudes a certain reluctance or hesitance, even when she's not playing a part and trying to seem that way. I contrast this with the leader of the Alice Network, Lily, who seems strong-willed, sometimes to the point of recklessness, and you can see why Eve's character doesn't quite hit this mark. We could maybe give the author a pass on this and argue that Evelyn isn't actually as bold and fearless as she herself likes to believe, or at least not at the beginning of the story in the first timeline. If so, which is really the explanation that makes the most sense to me, I still think this could have been executed a little bit better to convey a little bit more of a sense of an unreliable narrator. I don't know though, if you've read this novel, what did you think of young Eve as a character? There also remains this question throughout the book for us readers of what trauma happened to the young Eve to turn her into this dramatically different person when we meet her in the later timeline. I did feel by the end that this was sufficiently justified, and although I don't want to get into spoilers, dealing with our past traumas is certainly a theme in this story for more than just one character, as we soon find out that Eve is not the only one who seems to be suffering from PTSD in one form or another. This aspect of the book received a pretty complimentary reception by other readers as well as in reviews I watched. Some readers might also be pleased to see in Eve a character who struggles throughout her life with a stammer, which is a challenge that receives respectful attention in the novel and that she's occasionally able to use to her advantage. In a YouTube interview with the author herself, which I'm going to link below, Kate Quinn, the author, talks about how her husband, who has a stutter himself, was an inspiration for this aspect of Eve's character, as he wanted to see this speech impediment represented by some more sympathetic characters than the usual ones in which it appears. On the other hand, Charlie wasn't such a compelling character for me. It's thrown in our face that Charlie is a math whiz right from the start of the novel, and since we spend a lot of time in her head, we hear how she thinks about the world and people in terms of equations, in terms where everything can be solved and everything adds up. But even right here, I feel like I'm expressing this already more eloquently than she expresses it herself. Not only did her character not seem true to reality for any person I've known who's good at math, like myself, for example, it seemed to me really hokey and just also entirely unnecessary because Charlie's math major in college is never relevant for the novel in any way. At the beginning of the story, I assumed it was going to be like her superpower or something, like maybe she'd be breaking codes later in the book and her math skills would like end up being really relevant. It turns out though that her superpower, if she's really as good as math as she says she is, will only ever be used to calculate tips at restaurants to save her traveling companions time. And thus this whole math thing that was played up at the start is not only a disappointment, but it also just feels really clunky whenever it resurfaces, seemingly just to remind us that Charlie isn't some plain old secretary or housekeeper, because she can also do math. So that alone already took me out of the novel whenever it came up, but it's not the only reason why I didn't like Charlie. For me, Eve felt written in a way, by contrast, that felt maybe a little naive or overzealous, but in a relatable way, and one that I mostly liked. Charlie, by contrast, felt actually just kind of dumb. I feel a little bit bad for saying this because she's supposed to represent a smart female character, but unfortunately for me it didn't work. I think part of this is an unfortunate result of the way she was written. I mean, Eve is the main character of the story, but Charlie is sometimes used more as a way for the author to build suspense or to get us, the readers, thinking. So what it comes down to is that sometimes there are these clunky inner monologues where Charlie ends up asking questions that are meant to make the readers curious, but are totally unnecessary and make Charlie feel kind of slow-witted. We also meet a number of side characters, most of whom are adequately interesting, even if not terribly complex. The person who ends up being the novel's primary villain, who I won't name here just to avoid even mild spoilers, feels at times so revolting that it can be hard for us as readers to even see this person as fully human, as anything but evil with a capital E. And there were several other characters who we meet briefly, but maybe we don't see quite as much as I would have liked to see to really get inside their heads and just see what made them tick. The overall pacing of the novel for me was also pretty solid, which is important since the audiobook version of the novel takes a total of 15 hours, putting it well into that medium length sort of territory. In spite of this though, maybe because we didn't see too many scenes within the actual environment where the spying took place, it seems like Eve's early successes in gathering information come almost too quickly. Maybe I'm being a little picky here, and Eve certainly does eventually have to make pretty great sacrifices to collect this information, but I guess I would have just expected it to take a little bit longer, to take a few more mistakes before she ended up gathering the juiciest bits of intelligence, and it seems like making Eve have to pay a great price to get this information kind of substitutes for actually having to take the time that I think would have also been required. We do also get a bit of romance. I'm usually not that crazy about the romances in this type of novel, especially when it feels forced or like it's there because the author knows it's what the readers want. In this novel, the romance did feel to me like it's there because it's what the reader wants, but it also didn't really seem terribly forced to me either, and it was done in a way that at least felt relevant to the broader narratives. I wouldn't say it's anything to read this novel for in itself, but it was fine, and that's just my 2 cents. Unfortunately, there was one other flaw in this book for me which bears mentioning, and that's the ending. Don't worry, I'm not going to give any details whatsoever. It's just that we learn throughout the novel what these 2 main characters are struggling against, not only externally, but also internally. And for me, the ending just wasn't very satisfying because certain things weren't satisfactorily resolved for me. I don't mean that just like I didn't like the ending because it made me too sad or too happy or anything like that. I just mean it didn't feel like a proper ending to me. I can't really say much more since I pledged to do no spoilers, but I'm curious for those who have read the book as well, if you see what I mean here. So I did like this book, but not extraordinarily so. It was well done and seemed to me well researched, which I'll get into in a second, but it was also a fairly predictable and pretty safe plot overall. Like, it followed a pretty clean narrative, you could see where things were going. Upon first reflection, I was also going to say there really wasn't much to challenge me or to make me think super deeply, although this isn't totally accurate. In particular, some of the events towards the middle of the story and the decisions made by the characters to deal with them actually did get me thinking, but I wouldn't call the book deeply thought-provoking in that way. It kind of just feels like vanilla World War I or World War II fiction in that sense, but in that regard, it's at least done well, so there's not too much to complain about in that sense. In fact, the historical detail in this novel is a pretty cool feature and definitely worth mentioning. The Alice Network was indeed an operation that ran for about 6 months out of Lille, and was led by a woman named Louise de Bettigny, codename Alice Dubois, who was the character Lily in this novel. I'd actually recommend, if you're going to read this book, that you don't look too much into the real situation beforehand, but you should definitely check up afterwards on just which of the events and the characters of the story are real or based on reality. I myself was surprised to find afterwards that, in spite of it obviously being a fictional interpretation of these characters, a lot of the events in the story, including the specific pieces of intelligence that were provided by our protagonists, were actually pretty much in conformity with the real events. Similarly, I thought Kate Quinn did a really solid job of establishing the setting and the mood for this novel. She painted a scene of England and France during the war and post-war years and really transported me to this era, as did the audiobook version I listened to, which was narrated by Saskia Marleveld. Even the novel's cover just sets this tone right away with a grayish, hazy sky, a woman in a coat, and a bomber flying by overhead. It's simple, but it works, and throughout the book it works in a way that doesn't feel forced, it just works quietly in the background. This book is also a solid feminist story in its best parts, in the sense that it tells stories of women going through challenges that women would have historically faced at the time, and some of which are still real challenges for women today. Without giving spoilers, both of the main characters have to make several women-specific decisions and deal with women-specific challenges throughout the novel. Many of them are even just minor things, like the banker demanding written approval from her father before Charlie can withdraw money from her account, even though she's in her early 20s and of legal age to access her own savings, which she indeed did earn herself. Others feel more life-changing, including a challenge that is apparent right from the start in Charlie's storyline as she finds herself with an unplanned pregnancy and she's in tow by her mother to get an abortion in Switzerland, although she's less certain about what it is that she wants herself. Without giving anything away, I will say that I thought this decision and others like it were treated respectfully and in a way that acknowledges that sometimes women's best choice is far from obvious. So usually I found the author showed the right amount of restraint to make this work as a subtle feminist story, and one that captures the struggles of women without overtly making this book be a book about feminism. There were just a few cases where I thought the author tried to force it a little bit too much in a way that I think actually detracts from the book's feminism elsewhere because it forces you to think consciously about it. Charlie's being a math major for no apparent reason was the most egregious example of this, and in a few other moments I noticed a couple similarly awkward statements that seemed to be really just spelling out discrimination against women when we could have and would have easily inferred it from the narrative. Luckily, I don't think these moments were enough to detract from the overall feminist message of the book, which is one that I hope will be valuable for female and male readers alike. And on that note, I also should add, although women seem to be the main audience who are writing reviews and talking about this book, there's really no reason I can see why men wouldn't enjoy it too, in case you're wondering. And that's about all I have to say for this book. I liked it, and I rated it 3 out of 5 stars on Goodreads, which for me is not bad at all. Will I read more by Kate Quinn? I might. I'm not about to go and race through her entire collection ASAP, but I know she's released a few other historical fiction novels, including a few from the same time period, so I suspect I might check out another 1 or 2 of those at some point down the road. What did you think of this book, though? Have you read any other historical fiction novels lately, or anything else by Kate Quinn? Leave me a comment, or just subscribe if you want to hear more weekly reviews. Until next time, bye, and happy reading.